That's the grain guide me.
Oh my
Whereas
God.
with these ones, I actually cut them, so I had to cut across the grain
Yes.
and down the grain, and all sorts of ways to get the. But you've got to make sure that the timber is nice and dry.
Yes, yes.
But yeah, that's.
Oh my God, you're dangerous. You literally would use anything to leave your marks on it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, I'm so glad I've
I
come.
use a lot of silver work too. I love engraving on silver because it's such a beautiful metal to engrave on.
Right. And where do you get the silver material?
From
Where do you
the
buy it?
bullion suppliers.
From what supplier?
Bullion suppliers, from precious metal suppliers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
But I do a lot of work in platinum and gold as well.
Okay, welcome everybody.
Thank you.
To the fifth Derivan Artist Talk. We've got Rex here, and I won't speak a second longer, and I'll let Rex take it away. I'll just be on this camera over here, Rex.
Good. Thanks very much, David. Can I say I can't express just what a pleasure it is to be here. I love talking about the craft of engraving, and I don't use the word zen of engraving lightly, because there is something quite meditative and very, very relaxing when you're engraving. When the tool is nice and sharp and you're working with nice metal like copper or silver or even brass, and you're carving away and the metal is just spiralling up from the tool, it's just beautiful. There's a lovely zen, a meditative quality, as I said earlier, to the whole process. And I've been teaching engraving in TAFE at the Design Centre at Enmore from 1988 to 1999 when I left TAFE, and I'm still doing a lot of teaching. I teach at the McGregor Schools up in Toowoomba, which are run by the University of Southern Queensland, and I also run short courses for whoever's interested. And I do a lot of teaching within our industry as well. To give you a bit of an idea of where I came from to do all this, it goes back literally 2 generations. My grandfather was a jeweller and an engraver and an enamellist. My dad was also a jeweller and an engraver. My uncle was specifically an engraver, and I was very, very fortunate to be trained by Hardy Brothers when they were still the Viceregal Jewellers, and they were established in 1853. And I can remember when I started at Hardy Brothers, it was 1953, and I was earning £3.8 a week as an apprentice, a first year apprentice, £3.8, I mean really, and I was absolutely chuffed because the very first week that I started as an apprentice at Hardy Brothers, I got double my wages. And because it was their centenary, they paid everyone in the business double their wages for that week. So that was a real bonus for me. I'll never forget that. So you can see I've been doing this for about, 57 years, is it? Yeah, almost 57 years. 57 years on March the 19th, to be precise. I was trained as a jeweller as well as an engraver, and one of the engravers there was a fellow called George Casemore, who was a wonderful craftsman and in the old tradition taught me everything that he knew. One of the nice things about being a 3rd generation engraver is that you tend to inherit lovely things. And I've got a lovely old engraver here, an engraving tool, which is, it's got to be over 120 years old. It's a walnut handle, just a bit of old brass here, and you can pull it apart and the blade comes out and it fits together into that little groove, and the old bit of brass just pushes over the end there, and you can adjust that blade to any height you like, and it's one of the most beautiful tools that I still use to this day. It's for engraving double lines. So if I want to do 2 lines for, say, Roman lettering, I use this engraver. And it's just lovely to pick up that tool and use it and just meditate on the fact that my grandfather also used that tool. So it has a great resonance for me. So that's pretty well where I'm coming from. As far as the engraving process itself is concerned, it takes a while to learn. There are many types of ways of making marks on copper, especially if you're printing from the plate, which I love doing. And a lot of people etch with acid, or they use a steel point on the copper and they score the lines in. And all those techniques are very good and they have their purpose. But the engraving, using the burin as a cutting tool, where you actually engrave the line in, gives you another dimension completely. I love the idea of being able to do etching and steel point and then perhaps finish off with the burin, or maybe start with the burin and then finish off with a bit of etching. So for today though, I'm just going to talk about the zen of engraving, in other words, engraving by hand on copper plate, or any plate really, but engraving by hand. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, there's a few technical phrases I'll use, and I'll just quickly sketch a basic tool for you. Okay, there's our basic engraving tool, or burin if you want to use that phrase, and they come in a whole range of blades and sizes. Today we use high-speed steel. That's a high-speed steel blade, and you can always pick the high speed because they have a little dab of yellow paint on this section here, which we call the tang, and that goes into the handle. We can still buy wooden handles like this, or you can buy quite nice modern plastic ones. And the modern plastic ones, all you have to do is put them in a microwave, and they've got a special plastic inside the handle. The plastic goes soft and you just push the blade in, and when it cools down, it's solid as a rock. So easy to do a modern tool these days. But just to give you an idea of what's involved, we have the blade, this part, of course the handle. Those of you who are interested in other types of crafts where you might use files will recognise this little bit here as the ferrule. Now, if I was a wood engraver, just doing wood engraving, I would leave the tool like this, just as a plain tool like that. But because I'm an engraver, I rework the tool, the blade, so it's more like this. So we have this shoulder which is ground in, and what that does, it opens out the face of the tool, so that when we're engraving on copper or silver or brass or whatever we're using, or wood even, and I prefer to use the tool with the shoulder ground into it, even when I'm doing wood engraving like this one, it opens up the face of the tool so we can see much more easily where we're going. This part underneath here is called the heel or the belly, depending whether you're an American or an Englishman. And of course, this is your cutting face. And for most of these tools, that cutting angle is usually about 45 degrees. Because I'm a professional engraver and have to engrave lots of different materials, I find I'm engraving modern materials like stainless steel and titanium. And I find that if I'm engraving these harder materials like stainless steel or titanium, I might find that I've got to increase this angle here maybe to 50 to even 55 degrees. In other words, I'll make that angle of cutting a little steeper and therefore a little stronger. So you can see, you know, there's a little bit to be learnt here, and there's a lot of fine tuning that one does as one becomes more and more experienced. So when I'm referring to the tools, these are the sort of words I'll be using. Again, they have different shapes, and the three most popular tools that you will ever use if you want to be an engraver or if you want to have a go at it is my favourite, which is the onglet, which is a bit like a Gothic arch upside down. So it's in that section. There's the flat. Which is usually in that section. And then there's the square, which is in that section. Now there is a half round which curves away at the base like that. But most engravers, if they want to use a half round, they'll usually take an onglet and they'll round it off themselves. So just to put some names on those. Half round. Now, one of the other things you'll notice if you want to buy a book on engraving, and there's some quite good books, the best books, I might add, are the ones that have been reprinted from old titles. The Art of Engraving is an American book which was first printed in 1903 but has been reprinted, thank heavens. And then there's the Hardy and Bowman book, the Jewellery Engraver's Manual, which was first printed in 1954 but again has been republished. You'll find a lot of these books are republished by Dover Publications. They seem to specialise in older books which have gone out of copyright. Then there's more modern books which you may be lucky enough to find, although you don't often see these very much. I do a lot of book plates, and this is a book, a German book, printed in Germany and in German language, but all about book plates, and there's a whole range of different book plates in there, some quite modern, some very detailed, and they're always stimulating. And then of course there's really old books like this one I found in a second-hand bookshop just recently called English Book Plates, and this is 1892. And in here we have the book plate of Samuel Pepys, the great diarist in London. And when you look at this more carefully, and I'll leave it open at this page so you can have a look at this later, you'll see that there's an embossed line around that edge, and that has been cut in a copper plate like that, and then when it's been printed, the printing has actually embossed the edges of the plate into the paper. And it's just lovely because you think, well, someone has actually carved that plate by hand, using the burin, using the engraving tool, and he's cut all those little fine lines by hand. One of the other interesting things, I say he, it could well have been a woman. In the 1800s, when the newspapers were starting to be printed from steel plates, a lot of the engraving of those early engravings, and I can think of a famous one of the wreck of the Dunbar, which made caused a huge amount of interest in England, and the wreck of the Dunbar was shown, the boat foundering out of Sydney Heads, and people floating around in the water. And that steel plate was engraved by a woman. And women made up something like 80% of the people who engraved for the newspapers in the 1800s. Mainly because they had a very good aesthetic sense, they were patient, and they were proud of what they did. Whereas perhaps the blokes went a bit like bulls at gates or something, I'm not sure. But certainly to this day there's a wonderful tradition in England of women engravers. And I can think of, I just can't think of her name now, but there was a contemporary lady who engraved this beautiful bowl, the inside of a bowl, for the Queen Mother some 10 or 12 years ago. And it was a commemorative dish, and she engraved this beautiful bunch of roses in the bottom of this bowl, and it's still a tour de force of the engraver's art. Now, as you've possibly seen if you came over and had a look at the various tools, there are many different types of tools here. And the most important ones that I use, my favourite is the onglette, because I can do so much work with that. And then the next one I use is the square. Now when these are set up, they look like that. This is a tool which I've had for about 30 years. It's getting a bit worn down now, and perhaps later on when it really gets worn down, and I love my old tools dearly, I'll possibly pull that out of that handle and put it into a handle like that, which has a much longer shank on this section, so that we can see if we can extend the life of our tool by the shape of the handle. Some of these handles are almost impossible to buy these days. Once upon a time you could go to a jewellery supply company and buy all sorts of different handles, whereas these days with modern mass production mostly they look just like that if they're wood, or if they're plastic they're even shorter. But I've got to the stage now where I'm starting to turn down my own handles. I have a friend who has a wood turning lathe, and I pop over and borrow his lathe every now and then and turn up a few more handles for myself, which is sort of rather nice. It's nice to be able to do the whole thing. So what I'd like to do, just to give you an idea of what's involved with engraving, I'll do a little example here for you. Now don't be deterred by the fact that I have this very fancy little ball tool here with it's like a little vise, and it's got all these different little accessories, half of which I've never used, but it's got all these accessories to go with it, and that little object there cost me about $350. And I got a 10% discount because I'm a teacher. But a lot of the engraving that my dad did and my uncle did and my grandfather did was just on a block of wood. And this is a plate of brass which has just been stuck on there with a bit of shellac. This is one that I'm working on at present, and this is a very interesting example because it's going to be a combination of machine engraving, like you see the Mr. Minute people with their little machine engravers. It's a combination of machine engraving and hand engraving. So I'm going to rough that out with the machine first and then finish it off by hand. A lot of the heraldic work I do, where I'm doing a signet ring for example, where you might have quite a heavy relief which is then to be pressed into a wax seal, I'll often do all that work with the machine first and then finish off the more delicate work by hand. And why not? It's the commercial world we live in. I have to stay viable when I'm doing that sort of work, and we're not living in the days of Benvenuto Cellini where you might have had a wealthy patron who'd come along and support you for the rest of your life for a barrel of wine and a chunk of cheese every now and then. Okay, let me just quickly demonstrate something for you. I'm just going to quickly sharpen this tool. There's a way of testing whether tools are sharp, and many carpenters know this trick too. If you just rub a tool over your fingernail like that and it rubs around like that, it means the tool is blunt. It should actually catch on the softness of the tissue of the fingernail. It doesn't mean you drive it in and draw blood. Now, I just do this by eye. This 45-degree sharpening angle is not set in concrete. It can be 44, it might be 43, it might be 47. Doesn't matter, as long as it's consistent. So I just hold the tool firmly on the whetstone, roughly 45-degree angle. A few little turns like that, and it's sharp. I prefer the circular action. You see some engravers and setters who use the same tools who'll do this, and that will actually wear a groove in the tool after about 30 or 40 years. And I've had this tool for about 20 years now, and it's perfectly flat, and I just love it that way because there's no anomalies are going to occur on the cutting face. I know it's a very nice flat surface. It's the way I was taught to do it as an apprentice, and it made a lot of sense to me then, and it still does. Now when you do that, you'll find that there's a little burr will develop on the edge of the tool. So, not that I have a block of wood here, I don't want to use that, but I'll just use the edge of this. Just drive it into a block of wood, and that just takes that burr off. Then I have a little bit of aluminium here with a bit of leather on it, and that leather has been impregnated with jeweler's rouge, which is an iron oxide, and all I then do is just rub that tool backwards and forwards, a bit like your old granddad stropping his old cutthroat razor, and that not only takes the final burr off, but it polishes the heel. Remember we referred to this heel or belly here? And it polishes that, so we're left with a lovely, bright, glassy, shiny piece of steel. And look at that now, just the very weight of that tool on my fingernail. No need to dig it in and draw blood, but you can see it sticks now, and that means that the tool is beautifully sharp. When I was learning to engrave, George Casemore always used to reiterate to me, "Rex, it's the blunt tool that cuts you." And he was quite right, because it's the blunt tool that will slip off and dive into your finger or something like that. And I've got lots of little tattoos on this finger where I did just that because I wasn't paying attention, where it slipped off and put a bit of grime into my finger and it's become a permanent little dot. My only tattoo, I might add. Now, what I might do, I'll just use these glasses rather than use these because these might cover too much of the field of vision for you to see what I'm doing. Now, if I was working on a plate like this, I would just have the plate and I just sit it on the table like this and then start carving away. But because I've got this super U-Butte little ball, engraver's ball here, I can start in on that. Now say we might do a little monogram. Now I've just lightly rubbed the copper plate with a bit of 3000 grit emery. So I've just put a nice, soft, slightly satin finish on that copper plate. So it's smooth, it's a little bit dull, not too shiny, and I can just draw directly onto that with a pencil. Now I've just sketched a little R on there and we'll start the cuts. When I hold the tool, it's very important that it's well supported. Of course, it's nice and sharp, so it's going to dig into that metal, so it will resist. And that's a good thing because it means that I can just move the tool around like that and I've made a cut. Once I've made that first cut, I can then come back and do another cut around the other way to meet it.
So you move the base rather than the tool?
I move them both. I am moving the tool with very slight, subtle increments of movement, but I'm actually using the base and turning the job, yes, underneath the tool. If I was engraving on here, I'd be doing the same thing. I might start here and then move the tool and the base around while I'm cutting. The other thing you'll see me often do is this.
Not the wrong way.
Now I'm not going to stick it up my nose and draw blood, but just lightly drawing the heel of the tool across my nose, I'm picking up the natural oil from my skin. And that's quite a sufficient lubricant for what we want to do with that cut. And you'll see engravers doing this all the time. The hand engravers, people like John Thompson and dear old George Casemore, who's since passed away. But John Thompson is another engraver who's in the Dimmicks building. And if you, I'll put this up on the board for you, if you go onto John's site, you'll see some quite interesting work. John W. Thompson. I think it's .net.au. But anyway, if you Google John W. Thompson, that'll bring up the site. And it's a lovely site. His younger son, Peter, is very much into the modern technology of the internet, and he set up this lovely site for his dad. And there's some lovely material on that about hand engraving, which you'd find quite interesting. Now, a lot of people think that you might just pick up a tool and sort of hold it a bit like a scriber and somehow hold it like that and then just push it along into the metal. That's quite a dangerous way to work. The trick is to support the blade against your thumb, rest the thumb firmly on the piece of work which you're engraving, and often too I'll put my two thumbs together like that, and the cutting movement occurs in the movement of the fingers and the knuckles here and perhaps a little bit of the wrist. But you have to make sure that you've got a really nice strong support, otherwise you can slip off. And the other thing too, just be a little bit careful where the exit of this tool might be, because your finger might be in the way. So it can happen that you could slip off the tool and suddenly find that the tool has punctured a bit of skin and there's a little bit of blood starting to flow. Yes, of course. If it's convenient for you to come over and have a look. Now you'll notice too that I don't try and do one great big cut all at once. I tend to try and work most of my cuts piecemeal. I can always come around later on and make those final adjustments.
I can go.
That's all right.
What happens if the unthinkable happens and you take a really great gouge out of your job, especially on account of what would normally be finished?
Yes, that's a very good question. With anything, with any skill, it's as much knowing about how to get out of trouble as it is how to do it properly in the first place. Now, if you do make a dirty big gouge and things start to go pear-shaped on you, what you can do is get a pair of dividers, and there's a little spot actually where two lines didn't quite meet up, and I might have to correct that later on. You set the dividers over the mistake in one plane, and then set it over the mistake in the other plane. So then you make a mark on the back. So that's that mark. Then you make another mark. I'll put this up on the board for you.
Are you about to hit that through to raise the surface so you can polish it out?
Yeah, that's right. Say this is our plate. In this case, I've just slipped there a little bit. Now, I could grind that out, you know, with a little file or something like that, or get into it with the emery paper and just grind that away, but I would leave a little dint in the metal. Now, that mightn't be so important if I'm printing off the plate, but if I've got a nice presentation plate, you want that to be nice and flat. So, here's our dividers. So we've measured across there, and then we measure down across there, and on the back of the plate we make the two marks. Then we get a ball peen hammer, which is like that. We have like a little ball on the end, and jewellers keep that all nice and shiny and polished, and you just tap lightly a series of little dints around that area, and that will push, and you do that on a polished steel block we call a jeweller's steady, and because the steel is polished and hard, the mishap, the mis-engraved line, is then pushed forward and literally erased. And all you have to do then is just get a little bit of emery and just touch it up, and you might need to go over that line again just to re-engrave it, because you might find that where you had that little mishap, you might lose that little area of the line. So you then might just have to re-engrave through there to bring it back. But it's as simple as that. And it's one of the reasons that most engravers like to work with copper of no less than 1 millimetre thick, because that gives them that little bit of excessive thickness, extra thickness, to fix any little mistakes. But I might add that often the mistakes that occur there are only microns deep. You know, they're not really, really deep, and they're very easy to remove, especially in copper. It might be a little more difficult if it was stainless steel or titanium, and especially if it's a watch back in stainless steel. So you just make sure you don't make a mistake. You go very, very carefully. And it's a bit like drawing. Often when people first start to draw, they think that, for example, I teach jewellery design, and when I'm drawing a ring on the board so that everyone can see it, I can start with an ellipse, and I can draw a ring which appears to be quite confidently drawn, just roughly shading that in. I can draw something like that, and there's a real trick about that, because when you're drawing large, I'm using my elbow, my shoulder, my wrist as a series of fulcrums to draw that ellipse. But if I'm drawing in front of a client and I'm drawing down to more of a scale where they can understand it, I tend to gesture my line. So I draw as a series of strokes. And the same thing with engraving. We do a series of cuts, and then once you've got your series of cuts aligned, then you run over them and just make one nice steep line. There might be a little variation if you're working with silver, because silver is such a beautiful metal to work with. It's very soft, and the metal just creams away from the tool, whereas the other metals like copper and these ones tend to be a little bit hard. And there's another factor too, that as one is engraving, you are pressing that tool into the copper. So what's happening there is that you are actually work hardening the metal ahead of that cutting face all the time. So the metal is sort of growing in resistance all the time as you're moving through it. It mightn't seem all that obvious when you're working, because you just get used to the feel of it. But after you've been working, especially with a fairly complicated design on copper, it's surprising how hard that surface of the metal will become just from work hardening and the pressure of the tool pushing against those molecules in the metal. Now I'll just finish this off fairly quickly. The next thing I want to talk about, when we're engraving, especially with copper plate engraving, and especially if we're doing monograms, we have what we call the baseline when you first start the engraving, and then we have grace lines. Now, to take the example of the monogram for R, the convention is in engraving is that the heavier line, or the grace line, in this case this line down here, just to emphasise that becomes the grace line, and the convention is as you write, so that determines the grace line. So if I was writing this with a pen and ink, I would come down, my downstroke is going to be heavier, and this stroke up here is going to be lighter, but this stroke down there will be a little heavier again. So these become our grace lines. For example, up there will be a relatively light line, but that will be a grace line coming down through there. And that will be a grace line coming down through there. That won't be, but this little one here will be just form a little grace line there. So if we just think of the way we write, even if I was doing a monogram like that, and you'll notice on one of the plates I have put my my artist's signature, if you like, on the bottom of the plate, just like that. So this would become a grace line. That becomes a grace line. That becomes a grace line, because they're all the downstrokes. So just think of that. The grace line becomes the downstroke. Not very neat to do it on a downward slope like that, but never mind, that just to make it clear to you. So you can see they're the conventions that we follow. Now the beauty of using the onglette is that I can use the fine point to establish my baseline, in other words that, but then I can use the onglette and tilt it backwards and forwards from side to side to build up my grace lines. So I can then tilt that shape over, so I'm cutting more with that leading edge there and just a little bit of the point there. So I can tilt that over, come back, revisit that line, and by tilting the tool slightly sideways, broaden that line into a nice grace line, a bit like watching the ice skating in the recent Olympics from Vancouver. You see them do these beautiful curves, and I think, oh gee, I wish I could do that. But in a way, they lean into the curve and then they straighten up as they come out of it. And that's what we're doing with the tool. We lean the tool into the curve and then straighten up the tool as we come out of it. So we get that beautiful diminishing line coming around into the upward stroke. And it's not rocket science, but it does take some getting used to. Even with a lovely, perfectly sharpened tool, the resistance in the metal can quite surprise you at times. And you may prefer, if you're going to get into this, you may prefer to perhaps use zinc or even a piece of aluminium to practice on when you first get going. The beauty of copper, and this is a book plate that I made for my wife, the beauty of copper is that you can do many, many impresses off that, and it lasts very well. I could maybe get between 500 and 600 impresses off that plate before I would need to perhaps touch up some of the finer lines.
Is the process the same for the wood? The process the same for wood?
Yes, yes, pretty much the same, except that the wood is a lot softer. So if you wanted to practice and just get used to the engraving tools, wood might be a nice way to go. I quite like some of the Australian woods. This is just a piece of, I think it was a bit of swamp gum or something, but it was just a chunk I found in the bush and had been lying there for a long while. Obviously dried out, it's got a crack in it, and it seemed to be quite dense. And well, ideally you should, things like boxwood and cherry wood, pear tree, they're lovely dense timbers. They're fairly pale, so you can see what you're doing fairly easily on them. This was a little difficult because of the darkness of the timber. That's based on a MC Escher design, and I engraved the little zebras, the two zebras interlocking with each other there, but the rest of it was just scored. I didn't actually engrave the lines, I just let the grain of the timber determine the scoring, because I wanted that to, hopefully when I finish that off, it'll be just a very natural print where I'm exploiting the timber as much as the actual design.
Engraving on wood, would you use exactly the same kind of tool that you used or you have two separate sets?
No, just the same. That's just wonderful. As I say, the only thing is that I have I have taught engraving to people who are specifically interested in woodblock printing, and some of the people who took part in my class were experienced woodblock makers, and they were really there to see what I was going to say about it, and some of them were just a little bit affronted at the fact that I cut away the tool, that I cut that, ground that shoulder in that I was speaking of here. They were a little bit affronted that I ground a shoulder in because, well, they didn't do that. It was just a cultural tradition amongst woodblock engravers that they just used the blade as it was bought. But to my mind, I felt that it was better to open up the blade just so I could see where I was going a lot more clearly. I guess it's just what I got used to, and it's just horses for courses. Yes, and there's another factor too, as I pointed out to them. Well, I said, well, if you're going to be using modern high-speed steel blades, and of course they loved the modern high-speed steel, because, you know, I only have to sharpen these about once a month. But the point is that you've got to sharpen all that metal. That's a lot of metal to have to sharpen up, whereas my technique of cutting away the shoulder leaves you with a much smaller footprint on the cutting face, so it's a lot easier and quicker just to sharpen that up.
So there's no real advantage having the light shoulder. Yeah, as most woodworkers would normally.
I didn't see any advantage in just leaving the tool like that.
I'm just wondering why they did it in the first place.
Yeah. Oh, I think one of them argued that it kept the tool a little more rigid, and maybe for larger work they might have been used to using it like a chisel, like a woodworker would use a chisel to cut out the area that they don't want to print. But certainly I felt that the conventions that I was used to were just perhaps a little more practical and saved a lot of time too. So just very quickly, the other way to get a grace line, I can either use the onglet and just tilt it over a bit like the ice skater going around corners, or else I can use a slightly broader tool like the square, for example. You can see how this is a much finer blade here, whereas the square is literally at right angles. And I can go in with the square and do the same thing. Yes, that's nice and sharp. So now I'll just cut a grace line down using the square. Oh, look, the angle is very, very acute. It's just enough to go in and start to cut. When you look at that, at the angle there, it's about 3 degrees. Yes, it's very, very shallow. And if you put it in too deep, it'll want to go to China, you know, down through the floor, out the other end. That's another thing too, that when we prepare these tools, especially the square, because when we buy the blade for the square, that's what you get. Now I can cut that in half, and I can get 2 blades for the price of 1. That makes me very happy. Pass that around. Excuse me. But you can see that blade of the square leaves you with a very, very straight edge. Now when you try and engrave with that very straight edge, you want to cut in and then you want to come out again. And when it's just left like that, it'll just keep on going down it'll want to go out the other end of the other side of the metal. You know, I used to joke to my students as I wants to go to China. The fact is, when we do prepare the gravers, we pay a lot of attention to the heel and the belly. And I wanted to do those grace line cuts for you before I explain this, because this will make more sense to you now. With this part of the tool, if I use another coloured ink just to make this a little more apparent, the heel, this part, and the cutting face here, what we do, we cut that away, just grind it away into a soft curve, so that it will go in and then come out again. And the same thing with the onglet. Any of these tools, there's ever so slightly, when you look at them, there's an ever so slight, what we call set. The set equals, if you like, the exit cut. It allows us to make a neat exit cut so we can come out, and that way, by judging the angle of your attack, you might start at say 3 degrees, but you might, as you want to cut deeper, you might just raise that angle to maybe 4 or 5 degrees, usually not much more than that. But then as you come out of the cut, you might lower that right down, and if you don't have that little curve, the tool won't come out neatly. You'll be scraping this whole back of the tool along the surface of the metal, and like the ice skaters, you know, you can see that trail that they leave in the ice when they do a turn or when they're going along quite fast. You'll see that scrape. Well, we don't want to do that on our nice copper plate. Otherwise, we're going to have to clean all that up. Usually, I'll pass this tool around because this is a very good example of it. I usually just do it on the whetstone. I rest the heel of the blade on the whetstone, and then just raise it about 3 or 4 degrees, and then just grind a little flat. And I'll pass that around, and you can see, if you just wiggle it in the light, you'll see I've got 2 little facets right on the tip where I've just ground a little flat, and that's quite sufficient to allow me to go in and then come out again. And that's, I'll pass this around from this end. This is another good example of the set. If you just hold that on this flat bit of metal, you can see quite a noticeable amount of light come through right on the tip, where that blade just curves up ever so slightly.
Comes from a minuscule chisel.
Yeah, yeah, that's it exactly. But it just allows you to go in and then come out again with complete control. Now I'm just making some marks on the copper now, which you can look at later on, and I'm just showing you how you can use the square, for example, to start with your basic line and then tilt the square slightly and then straighten it again to get a series of changing lines of different cuts. And as you'll see from this finished plate later on, you'll see that there's quite a variation. The square graver tends to be better for cutting deeper lines, whereas the onglet, the slightly sharper point, tends to be much better for the finer lines. One of the other advantages of preparing the tool with a proper shoulder down to the cutting face is that although it's not very obvious when you're working, but it does leave the tip of the tool ever so slightly springy. It allows that tool, when you finish a cut, you'll often want to come to like a nice full stop, as it were. You may not want the line to finish off as a very fine disappearing line. You might want to come to a full stop. So that way, if the tool has been cut away and it's a little bit flexible on the tip, you can dig the tip of the tool in. So I've raised that up to about 45 degrees. You dig the tip of the tool in, which makes the burr a little bit weak, and then you just flick it out like that. Now it's hard to see, but that little burr has completely disappeared, but it's left the end of the cut nice and squared off. So in other words, the cut has come to a nice neat full stop. Up and then flick. If it doesn't come away straight away, as that one didn't, it doesn't matter. A few little flicks and it'll go away, and you're left with a nice squared off end to your cut. So there's a few small practical aspects of using the tools. Now you can see again that the tools vary a bit in length. For most of us, when we're determining the size of the tool, the worst thing that can happen is that the tool, the blade of the tool, will be too long. If the blade is too long, it's almost impossible to use it properly. And the way we determine the length of the blade being correct is by resting the handle in the centre of the palm like that, and the tip of the blade should come somewhere near the ball of our index finger, like so. Now for my hand, that's a very comfortable length. If it was any longer, up here for example, sticking up above with the handle down here, I might even have a terrible old tool that does that. No, they're all pretty right. But that's about the longest tool I've got. Now that's worn down. You can see that that's well short of what I just said. But you can always use a shorter tool, because you just bring it forward a little more in your hand and you adapt. And I just love using that tool because I've just got so used to it. And it's just getting just a little bit too short now, and soon I'll be pulling that out and putting it into a longer handle to extend its life. But this one works beautifully. Now, if someone had and this is where, when I'm teaching, if the students don't have their own tools, or if they do have some old tools that they've found somewhere, I always like to make sure that that tool is tailor-made to that student. I recently taught a gem setting and engraving course at Toowoomba at the McGregor School, and I spent 2 days just preparing the tools for my individual students. I had 15 students, and they each had 3 gravers. They had the onglet, the flat and the square, and I prepared each one of those tools for the individual students. Now I went to some trouble. I suppose in one sense we lost 2 days of teaching because I was busy at the grinding wheel preparing those tools for those students. But nonetheless, what those students each ended up with was a set of 3 tools which were perfect for their hand, for the size of their hand. Some of the girls had quite small hands. 3 girls had come up from Melbourne. One of them was a dentist, and she had quite dainty little hands. So a tool like that would have been hopeless for her to use. So it was better for me to prepare those tools properly, because then it meant the student had a tool which was perfect for their hand. And it was also a guide for when they wanted to make their own tools and prepare their own tools, as one can. And I have someone ask me a few questions later on about where do we get these tools, how much do they cost, all those sort of questions which I'm sure you'll want to know. So it is important, very, very important, to have the tools set up exactly to your hand. But don't forget, if it's a slightly shorter tool, it doesn't matter. But if the tool is too long, then it becomes very unwieldy and difficult to use. Now, I could spend hours enjoying the zen of engraving and having a nice little time and getting lost in the copper here, but what I'd prefer you to do is perhaps have a little bit of an open discussion about this now, and I'm quite happy to answer questions for you. It may be about the technical details of what I've done here. It may be about the more plebeian things of Emma Chiswick, how much does it cost, and where do you get the bits and pieces. Just one little thing before we start on that. Some of the examples here I've got to show you, these are practice plates. Before I start work, I love to just get a little bit of copper and just do a few practice cuts. It's like any art form. You're always at your most comfortable when you've done a little bit of practice, you've got yourself into the zone and you're confident. So I always have these little bits of copper kicking around, and these are some plates that I've just used up over the years and thought I'd bring them along and show you. This plate here is a little bit different. I had a bit of fun with this when I was teaching heraldic engraving in TAFE. I invented my own family crest, and when you look at this closely, you'll see that there's a pencil and a brush crossed over where normally you'd expect to see arrows or swords, and on the actual shield itself there's a knight's helmet, but below the shield you'll see 2 crossed gravers on it, and there's a few made up things, but I had to study Latin at one stage of my life. It was another area of my life, and I made up a motto here: vir sine vinum bos est, which is Latin. Vir sine vinum bos est is Latin for man without wine is an ox. I thought that was just very appropriate for me. And then you'll notice underneath there, I've actually engraved my signature. One of the lovely things we used to do at Hardy Brothers in the old days, for the cricket matches, when the Englishmen came over and tried to trounce us with the Ashes, they had the Sheffield plate, and there was a big dish that was presented to each cricket team every time they had the tournament. And we would, as the engravers, we would get all the cricketers to sign their name. So I had Richie Benaud's signature and all these famous cricketers, and then we would engrave their signatures onto the silver salver. And it was really a lovely thing to do, but it made me aware that engravers can be very, very good forgers. So you'll see that my signature there is actually quite accurate to what I would put on my cheque, so please don't don't get any ideas. Some of this other work here, some of this beautiful work here is John Thompson's. He's a very good friend of mine and I respect his work enormously. John doesn't use one of these or a magnifying glass. He actually uses a binocular microscope. And he's got this beautiful setup. It's about $3,000 worth of Zeiss microscope. And he sits back with his eyes glued to these two eyepieces, these two oculars, and he can work sort of well away very comfortably. His back's nice and straight, and he just works away, but he's looking at his work at 20 times magnifications. These are 3.5 magnifications. So when you look at John's work, and this one here, the finch on the berries, is just exquisite. And these are carved, he's cut these in copper plate, and these are printed directly onto a bit of card. He printed these for me and then signed them, which I think is just wonderful. But when you look at the detail, if you like, you know, use my binoculars to have a look, or use these magnifiers here to have a look at the work, because it's actually quite exquisite. And John engraves wedding rings, and then he does copper plate engraving for invitations for weddings. He might charge $1,000 to do a plate like that, and it's worth every penny, because he then gives the plate to the client and it's theirs for all time. And what a lovely memento.
How long would it take to do a plate?
Oh, John would spend maybe a week. Yeah. And I don't, goodness knows how long that one took him. When I look at some of the fine lines, and he's a very good artist, I mean, his work is just beautiful. And the heraldic work like this one, when you look at the detail in that, and the shading, and all the different conventions that he's used for the coloration, is just wonderful.
Is the engraving that you do, is that the same tools and techniques that they used, say, in the 16th and the 17th and the 18th
Yes.
century? Those
Yes.
ones with incredibly detailed portraits and reproductions of the
Yes. And the tools they used were like these. This is a tool which is, this was my grandfather's. It's got to be 120 years old. It's a walnut handle, just a little groove, and this steel is, it's not iron, it's tool steel, but it's quite old tool steel. And the modern steels that we use today, like this stuff, the high-speed steel with a little bit of yellow paint to signify that it's high-speed steel. Also, it's etched on the side. When you have a look at this later on, it's got HSS, high-speed steel, and that's got tungsten and molybdenum and various things in it to make it very, very hard. And whereas this doesn't. This might have some carbon. The iron masters of the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, they had all these secret recipes. You know, they'd be melting iron, and the ironmaster would come in with a little leather bag and he'd shake this stuff into the iron, wouldn't let anyone see what he was doing. And what he was putting into the iron were, I don't know, carbon and various things like that. Perhaps herbs and spices, I don't know. But whatever they put into the iron hardened it into steel. And so some of these tools, you know, I mean, from the Iron Age onwards, there was continual experimentation, and the iron masters were like magicians almost, and respected like a priest almost, for their skill in making the iron hard. So we underestimate the technology of the Middle Ages. What they achieved was just wonderful. I have an engraving of a jeweller's workshop which was made in 1536, and I can recognise the bench, the tools, the types of pliers, the draw bench for pulling down wire. All those things are immediately recognisable to me now in the 20th century. The only thing that varies now is that we might have more electronica. We use a lot of dental technology now. I have the most beautiful little motors in hand pieces which are completely vibration free. A lot of the engraving now is done with the high-speed steel tool, but the handle encloses a little air ram, which is fed by a little plastic tubing with compressed air. And this little ram is hammering away in there at something like 30,000 strokes a minute. So it's just like a little high-pitched whine, and all you have to do is hold the tool on the metal and just push it through the metal. And when I first used one, I sort of went into it as though I was using a hand engraver, and I actually went right through the plate. And it was 1mm copper, and I went right through it, like driving a nail through a bit of timber. Amazing. Yes, yes, you can. Although the burrs that we use, even though they're the fine, very fine dental burrs, they tend to fur the edge of the timber a little bit, whereas the burin, the engraving tool, tends to give you a lovely clean cut and doesn't leave that furry edge. And you'll notice that on this, and that's not a hardwood, that's just a piece of indeterminate Australian wood, but it's got lovely crisp edges on that, which I would never ever get with a burr. Oh, got a kitchen table? Got a room big enough to put a kitchen table in? This is huge. My bench at home is half this size. It's hard. Yeah. And I mean, you don't need this sort of thing. I mean, this is pretty fancy American gear, GRS. But as I say, often engravers, and I should have brought it, I didn't think to bring it. Engravers often just work off a sand pad. Just a bit of leather. You can get a local shoemaker to make yourself one of these. Just two circles of leather. Get the guy to stitch them together and leave one end open. So stitching all the way around. Leave one end open and just fill that with sand. So it'll end up something like that, and all this is stitched. And you just finish off the stitching once all the sand is in there. And often engravers just use a sand pad on a table. It's just something soft. They can hammer it down nice and flat, put their block of wood with a bit of metal pinned or glued to it, and then just work directly off that. That's a good question. All these tools are readily available. There's a number of jewellery supply houses. The biggest, and there's no financial remuneration in this for me by telling you this company, but the biggest one with the most gear is House of Jewellery. Their website is hoj.com.au. They have a huge range of gravers. They have the high-speed steel like this. They cost about $24 for a blade. And the ordinary steel, I don't think I've got any in here. Oh, hold on. Yeah. Oh no, that's high-speed steel too. But the ordinary blades are just tool steel, and they're just like black steel like that. They work at about $22. And many jewellers prefer the ordinary, that's ordinary tool steel compared to high-speed steel. Many jewellers prefer these because they can actually manipulate the blade and bend them. For example, if I can find it, amongst all this stuff. But anyway, see how that's curved? They normally come straight. But that was, I actually softened the steel, got it red hot, let it cool down slowly, and then bend it into that shape so I could go in and then come out, like I was describing earlier with the set. Whereas with these ones, you can't do that. When you grind that little curve in, you have to grind it in, because even if you heat these up to red hot, they're so hard they won't bend. They stay hard even after red hot. And normally any other tool would blunt when you get it red hot, but these don't. Amazing material.
So if you're cutting your own shoulder in those tools, it'd be better to do a nice spread steel rather than normal, because it loses its temper.
Yeah.
Otherwise you'll have the whole stuff.
Yeah. Or else if you are using the ordinary steel, tool steel, continually dip it in water while you're grinding it away to stop it from getting too hot. But with these, I actually did it once. I ground away the shoulder really fiercely, and the blade went blue with heat. Now normally that would mean that the blade is far too soft to use, and you have to harden it and re-temper it again. In my notes, when I teach this course, I've got a section in the back about hardening and tempering for those who are interested in that, and many people are. But this thing went deep blue. It should have been as soft as anything, and it was just as hard as before. I don't know what's in these things, but it's just amazing. But the beauty of it is, once you've got it set up, it'll last you for a month before you have to resharpen it. So, House of Jewellery, they have a huge range of all these tools in all different sizes. If you are buying these yourselves, I'd recommend when you ask for an onglet, you ask for a number 3. Number 3 is just a nice size. The flat, they're sold according to the width of that cutting edge there. Now the ones that I usually start my students with are number 10, which is 1 millimetre across there. But they can come down to 0.5 of a millimetre, or 0.7 or 0.8. You can get them in all these different millimetre sizes. And the square, if you're going to buy a square, the one that I passed around, if you notice the etching on that, it was 2.25 millimetre square. And that's a really convenient size for 90% of the engraving you'll do. Because remember, you don't really cut all that deeply. It's really just that extra little bit of width that the 90-degree angle gives you in the square that's important. So it wouldn't matter whether it was 2 mil or 2.5, but it'd be stupid to buy a 5 mil. Now you could buy a 5 mil one, but really that's more for chiselling. I've never done this, but in America, gun engraving is very, very popular. And that's where they use these larger blades, because often the gun engraving is done with a little hammer and the blade itself, and they actually hammer because they're having to carve through the steel of a Colt 45 or a Winchester repeating rifle or something, and the steel around the bolt action of a rifle is very, very hard. So they use the high-speed steel, and they do all their engraving by hammering. Or nowadays they're often using the compressed air type tool, where you have a little tube coming up into the handle with a little hammer inside the handle, which is hammering along the length of the blade and driving the blade easily through the hardest of materials. Wonderful technology, wonderful technology. So House of Jewellery, I'll give you their address. It's 81 York Street. And they're on the 6th floor. Yeah, look, I run workshops quite regularly. I do a lot of workshops within our own industry. The most recent one was Fairfax and Roberts, where I ran an engraving course for the girls down there. It's a very interesting workshop in Fairfax and Roberts. They're all girl jewellers. There's a French girl and 2 girls from Germany, and one of my ex-students is in charge of the workshop. And it's an all-girl team, and they're just brilliant, brilliant. And it was just lovely teaching them because they just took everything so seriously. One of the things I love doing, and I emphasise this to my students, when we shape a tool, I like to think that the tool has, if you like, an aesthetic quality. That it looks nice. When you look at it, you think, oh, gee, that's nice. Look at that lovely bright polish on the heel there. And I mean, you mightn't think this consciously, but you'll pick up the tool and you say, oh, isn't that interesting? Aren't these lovely old tools? Because they look nice. A lot of jewellers don't seem to understand this. They'll, instead of putting a nice graceful curve into the shoulder, they'll do something like that. And to me, okay, it works, but it looks horrible, you know. And also they're going to run out of puff fairly quickly, you know, grinding that face away and keeping it sharp. So why not make something graceful like that, where the curve and the strength of the blade is confirmed all the way up there, because it starts thin here but gradually gets thicker and thicker. So you've got all this beautiful strength built in to the blade, and you've also got that little bit of springiness that I was talking about earlier when you want to just flick that last little burr out of the way. So I showed the girls down at Fairfax and Roberts how to set up their tools, and when I went in the next week to continue the next stage of the course, all their tools were beautifully polished, every part of the tool, the shoulder, the handle. They'd even polished the brass of the ferrule. They were so pleased with their tools and so proud of them. And I thought that was really lovely. Wouldn't get too many blokes doing that. More's the pity. Yeah, so yeah, I'm quite happy to run little short courses. Usually I find 5 or more people makes it worthwhile. I'm quite happy if anyone's over my way. I live over at Hurstville. If you want to drop me a email or give me a call, I wouldn't normally put that sort of detail up everywhere, but if you are over my way and if you're coming by and if I'm home, give me a call. I'm quite delighted to take people through my workshop and show them the way I work. It's not as tidy as this, but you know, it's authentic, and often there's little things that people might want to know that will occur to them later on, and if I can help, drop me an email or give me a call if I can help at all. I'm only too pleased. I'm a professional teacher. I mean, I was trained as a teacher, and I grew up in a tradition where there were no trade secrets. I grew up in a tradition where it was very much drummed into me that the person who believes in trade secrets is not a good craftsman. A good craftsman will share things because he or she is always moving on. So I don't hold back. So any questions at all, I don't mind answering them, and to the best of my ability. Sorry, you're going to...
That's all right. Is there a good place in Sydney to find any engraving pieces of wood?
Look, I'm honestly not sure. I'm sure there must be. I've not gone into the commercial side. I've got lots of friends who are woodies, and they're always giving me offcuts of timber and quite interesting bits, and they know that I like hardwoods. So I often get little bits of ebony and stuff like that given to me. And ebony's beautiful to work with. That's so hard. But it's very expensive. But I'm sure there would be places timber supply companies that would supply very well seasoned hardwoods. Cherry wood, box, pear, they're the traditional ones. Any other queries there?
Any other questions for Rex before we wind up? The people that are invited to come and touch these?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Yes, yes. Look, these are all nicely polished, and I purposely polished them up so that you'd see them at their best. But don't feel afraid to pick them up and have a look at them. You might put finger marks on them, but they come off. That's all right.
Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. Come. Ask Rex questions if you want, one-on-one, but thanks for coming. And we hope to see you again. Thank you, Rex.
Thank you. I might add, if you are interested in a course, I usually supply the notes, like a full set of notes like these, and if people want me to, I supply the 3 major tools, the onglet, the flat and the square, and with all the handles, and usually enough bits of copper for everyone to have a play with, so I can supply a little kit. And the kit usually works out, by the time you do all the bits and pieces that you need, handles, copper, it usually works out about $135 for the kit. And to me it's pretty good value. It gets you started, and you'll have the tools for the rest of your life, believe me. Look, usually I can get people started off within a day, but it's nice to follow through with another day down the track when people have been working a bit. Yeah. The worst thing the thing that people have the most difficulty with is holding the tool, just getting used to holding the tool correctly so that they can carve into the metal and not have the tool fly off and dig into your finger or something like that.